The bank app refreshed on my phone screen, and I watched every number collapse into nothing. Checking account, $0. Savings account, $0. Emergency fund, $0. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out the kitchen sounds around me. I stood frozen, staring at the zeros that had replaced months of careful saving, years of financial planning, the security I'd built transaction by transaction. Behind me, my husband Dominic leaned casually against the kitchen counter. His arms crossed over his chest. His voice came out flat, almost bored, lacking any hint of guilt or concern. I moved the money. Don't make this dramatic, Rebecca. You'll stay quiet about this. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and a small smile flickered across his mouth, the kind of private, satisfied expression I hadn't seen directed at me in months. That smile told me everything the empty accounts hadn't already communicated. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate, planned, and connected to someone else. Someone who made him smile like that. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, my grip tightening on my phone until my knuckles went white. $38,000. Moved by the man I'd trusted completely, shared everything with, built a life alongside for 6 years. My throat burned with words I couldn't release. Questions, accusations, demands. All of them crowded my mouth but stayed trapped behind my teeth. No sound came out. I just stood there, staring at my reflection in the dark screen of my phone after the banking app timed out. I watched my face drain of color, watched my eyes go wide and glassy. Dominic mistook my stillness for defeat, for surrender, for the compliance he'd commanded. "You don't need all that money anyway," he added, his tone dismissive, like he was explaining something obvious to a child. "I'm handling things. This is temporary. You're overreacting by even checking the accounts." His casual cruelty should have made me explode. Should have triggered screaming, throwing things, demanding answers and accountability. But some instinct deeper than conscious thought kept me silent. Screaming would have given him power. The power of my emotional breakdown, my visible desperation, my public collapse. And standing in that kitchen, staring at those zeros, I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I wasn't giving him anything. Not my tears. Not my panic. Not the satisfaction of watching me crumble. I nodded slowly, mechanically, my expression carefully neutral. "Okay," I whispered. Just that one word, delivered so quietly he had to lean forward slightly to hear it. The relief that washed over his face was almost worse than the theft itself. "My name is Rebecca Torres. I'm 32 years old, a financial analyst for a healthcare company, someone who understood money, budgets, and the importance of financial security. For 6 years of marriage, I'd been the one who paid the bills on time, balanced the accounts meticulously, built our savings dollar by dollar. I'd believed deeply in partnership, in marriage as a team effort, in transparency and shared decision-making. Every major purchase, every financial choice, every adjustment to our budget, I discussed all of it with Dominic, seeking his input, making decisions together. That's what I'd thought we were doing. Building something together. Planning a future jointly. Saving for the house we'd talked about buying, the children we'd discussed having, the life we'd mapped out during late-night conversations when everything had felt solid and real. Standing in that kitchen, staring at my phone screen, I realized with brutal clarity that the person I'd trusted most had already decided I was disposable. My contributions were resources to be extracted. My financial security was something he could eliminate at will. The partnership I'd believed in had been one-sided, my loyalty and effort funding a life I hadn't known existed. A life that included someone else. Someone he smiled for while taking everything I'd worked to build. That night, Dominic went to bed easily. He fell asleep within minutes, his breathing settling into the steady rhythm of someone without guilt or worry weighing on his conscience. I lay beside him in the dark, every muscle rigid, my mind racing through implications and possibilities. After an hour of listening to him sleep peacefully while I trembled with shock and fury, I got up quietly and went to the dining room table. I opened my laptop and started scrolling through months of transaction histories, my accounting training kicking in automatically. Transfers labeled investment, temporary, personal business. The descriptions were vague, deliberately uninformative, but the destinations told a different story. Boutique hotels in cities we'd never visited together. Luxury rental properties. Jewelry purchases from stores I'd never received gifts from. Restaurant charges from places he'd claimed were business dinners. The pattern emerged with devastating clarity. This wasn't sudden or impulsive. This was systematic, planned, executed carefully over months while I'd trusted completely. My hands shook as I created a spreadsheet, documenting every suspicious transaction with dates, amounts, and merchant information. The organization calmed me slightly, gave my shock and pain a structure to exist within. But my mind kept sharpening with each entry, my professional detachment taking over from emotional devastation. This was evidence. This was documentation. This was preparation. One charge made me stop breathing. The Riverside Resort, a weekend destination I'd mentioned months ago as a potential anniversary trip. I'd shown Dominic the website, talked about how beautiful the property looked, suggested we could celebrate our upcoming anniversary there. He'd said it seemed expensive, that we should save money for more important things. But here was a charge for a 2-night stay. Booked 3 weeks ago. Our anniversary was still 2 months away. My chest tightened painfully as I pictured him at that resort. Not with me, the wife who'd suggested it, but with someone who'd received my anniversary trip as a casual weekend getaway. Someone who thought my life, my marriage, my carefully saved money was just a bonus feature funding her lifestyle. The betrayal stopped being abstract numbers on a screen. Had fingerprints now. Faces, even if I couldn't see them clearly yet. It had moments that should have been mine, experiences stolen and given to someone else. I zoomed in on the transaction details, noting the exact dates, the full amount, the booking confirmation number visible in the description. Then I added it to my spreadsheet, highlighting it in red. This wasn't just financial theft anymore. This was the destruction of our marriage, documented in hotel charges and restaurant bills, funded with money I'd earned and saved and trusted him to respect. The next morning I made coffee like always, set out his favorite mug, asked if he wanted scrambled or fried eggs. My voice was steady, my movements calm, my expression pleasant. Dominic looked relieved when he came into the kitchen, seeing me functioning normally. His shoulders relaxed. A hint of smugness entered his expression as he accepted the coffee and requested scrambled eggs. "See," he said, kissing my forehead briefly before sitting at the table with his phone. "I knew you'd be reasonable about this. You always understand that sometimes I need to make financial decisions quickly. That's what makes us work. You're not dramatic like other women." I smiled because it cost me nothing. Because maintaining that mask took less energy than the confrontation he expected and feared. Because he had absolutely no idea what quiet really meant. He thought my silence was compliance. He thought my calm was acceptance. He thought I was being reasonable by not demanding explanations for $38,000 disappearing overnight. What he didn't understand was that my quiet was strategic. My smile was armor. My apparent submission was actually preparation. I served him breakfast, refilled his coffee, chatted pleasantly about weekend plans. And the entire time I was calculating, planning, building a case with the same methodical attention I brought to financial analysis at work. He'd underestimated the woman who kept the books. That would be his biggest mistake. As I went through my morning routine, shower, makeup, professional clothes for work, moments from the past year replayed with cruel new clarity. Dominic insisting we consolidate everything into joint accounts for simplicity. Him laughing when I'd asked about irregular withdrawals, calling me paranoid and controlling. His irritation when I'd suggested we needed better budget tracking. The time he'd called me uptight for wanting transparency about a $3,000 charge I hadn't recognized. I'd backed down every time, accepting his explanations, trusting his dismissals, believing that marriage meant not being suspicious of your partner. I'd thought I was being a good wife by not questioning him constantly. Now I understood I'd been systematically trained to ignore red flags, to doubt my own observations, to accept that my concerns were overreactions. I hadn't been paranoid. I'd been observant. And I'd been deliberately silenced. My instincts dismissed as flaws rather than warnings. The gaslighting had been so subtle, so consistent, that I'd internalized it. Started apologizing for having questions. Started accepting blame for being too concerned about our finances. That pattern was clear now, looking back with the knowledge of empty accounts. He'd needed me compliant to execute this theft. He'd needed me trained to stay quiet, to not dig deeper, to accept his word without verification. And I'd cooperated perfectly, right up until the moment he'd taken everything. During my lunch break at work, I made a phone call I'd been considering all morning. I scheduled a consultation for that evening, giving minimal details over the phone. When I arrived at the law office after work, I brought printed bank statements, my spreadsheet of suspicious transactions, copies of account agreements showing both our names. No drama, no tears. Just facts organized chronologically and highlighted for clarity. The attorney across the desk was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that made me feel less alone. She reviewed my documentation carefully, asking clarifying questions, taking notes. When she finished, she didn't look shocked, just concerned in the way of someone who'd seen this pattern before. "You did the right thing coming in early," she said, emphasis on that word. "Before you confronted him. Before he knew you were documenting. Before assets could be hidden more thoroughly." That word, early, felt like oxygen entering a room where I'd been suffocating. I wasn't too late. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't trapped in a situation with no options. I was early in a process that had clear steps, legal protections, and potential outcomes that didn't involve me accepting theft and betrayal. She explained my options calmly, using language I could understand despite the emotional fog making it hard to concentrate. We discussed timelines, evidence gathering, financial protections. By the time I left her office, I had a plan. Not a revenge fantasy. Strategy. At home that evening, Dominic grew bolder. He'd been out when I'd returned from the attorney consultation, arriving an hour later wearing new clothes I'd never seen before. Designer labels, the kind he'd always claimed were wasteful when I'd suggested we could afford nicer things occasionally. He took a phone call outside on the deck, speaking in tones too low for me to hear but laughing frequently. When he came back inside, he seemed energized in a way I hadn't seen directed toward our life together in months. He started talking about his future over dinner, plans for a business venture he'd been considering, maybe a career change, possibly relocating to a different city if the right opportunity emerged. Each sentence was phrased individually, as if these were separate thoughts. But together they painted a picture. He was planning a life that didn't include me. He believed I was stuck here, dependent on him somehow, despite me earning a comparable salary. Afraid to leave, to make waves, to disrupt our marriage. Too compliant, too reasonable, too trained to stay quiet to challenge him. I listened and asked interested questions and nodded supportively. And the entire time I let him keep believing I was trapped. That his theft had worked. That his command to stay quiet had been effective. Because his confidence was making him careless. And careless people made mistakes that ended up documented, traceable, and legally significant. Over the following week, I organized everything into detailed folders, digital and physical. One folder for joint account transactions with highlighted suspicious charges. Another for statements showing the pattern of money movement over 6 months. A third for credit card bills revealing expenses he'd hidden. A fourth for text message screenshots where he'd lied about his location. The chaos of betrayal was overwhelming when experienced emotionally, but contained within folder structures, labeled and dated and organized, it became manageable. Evidence instead of pain. Facts instead of heartbreak. The pattern was undeniable once laid out systematically. This wasn't a mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. This wasn't even an affair that started impulsively and spiraled out of control. This was calculated financial theft executed deliberately while maintaining the facade of marriage. Every withdrawal had been planned. Every lie had been intentional. Every dismissal of my concerns had been strategic manipulation. I slept better once the chaos had clear edges, once my shock and hurt were transformed into documented reality that existed outside my emotional experience. The spreadsheets didn't care that I felt betrayed. The bank statements didn't need me to process feelings before being valid evidence. The truth existed in those folders independent of whether I'd healed from learning it. That separation gave me power I hadn't felt since seeing those zeros on my phone screen. I finally saw her name on a receipt I'd overlooked initially. Sophie Brennan. It appeared on a jewelry purchase, listed as gift recipient in the store's detailed invoice. The name appeared again on a hotel booking confirmation buried in Dominic's email account, which I'd accessed using a password he'd never changed. Sophie Brennan checked in for a weekend at that anniversary resort I'd wanted to visit. Sophie Brennan received the bracelet from the boutique downtown, the one that cost almost $2,000 of our joint savings. She wasn't a faceless abstraction anymore. She was real, named, documented. Part of me wanted to find her online to see what she looked like, to understand what made her worth destroying my financial security and marriage. Another part wanted to contact her, to warn her that a man who stole from his wife probably couldn't be trusted with her heart either. But I didn't do either of those things. I didn't reach out. I didn't investigate beyond what was necessary for documentation. This wasn't about her. She might not have known he was married, might be as deceived as I'd been about different aspects of his character. Or she might have known exactly what she was participating in. Either way, she wasn't my focus. This was about the man who thought consequences were optional, who believed he could steal, lie, betray, and command silence, and face no accountability for any of it. Dominic tested me one evening about a week after the money disappeared. We were sitting on the couch watching television, my body next to his but my mind miles away planning next steps. During a commercial break, he muted the sound and turned to face me. "You're not thinking of telling anyone about the money situation, right?" His tone was casual but his eyes were sharp, watching for my reaction. My stomach clenched, but I kept my expression neutral. Met his gaze directly and said softly, calmly, "No." The relief on his face made my stomach turn with disgust. His shoulders relaxed. His jaw unclenched. He leaned over and kissed my forehead like I was something he owned, something that had just confirmed its obedience. "Good," he said, satisfaction clear in his voice. "I knew I could trust you to be smart about this. Some women would overreact, but you understand that marriage means supporting each other's decisions." He unmuted the television and went back to watching like nothing significant had just happened. Like he hadn't just confirmed his belief that I was compliant, silent, and controllable. I sat there feeling his arm around my shoulders. His body pressed against mine, and fought the urge to recoil. Sharing space with someone who'd stolen from me felt violating. But I maintained the mask. Stayed quiet. Let him believe his test had confirmed my submission. Because his confidence was the rope he was hanging himself with, pulled tighter with every assumption of my weakness. I followed my attorney's instructions carefully over the next 2 weeks. No sudden changes to routine. No emptied accounts. Not that there were accounts left to empty. No dramatic exits or confrontations. Everything I did was documented, timed, and legally sound. I opened a new bank account at a different institution, listing only my name. Started redirecting my paycheck deposits there instead of into joint accounts Dominic had already drained. Created a paper trail showing I was protecting my current earnings, not stealing marital assets. I documented every conversation where Dominic discussed his plans, his business opportunities, his potential relocation, saved text messages, backed up emails, recorded dates and times when he was absent from home for suspicious lengths of time. Everything my attorney had advised as important for building a case. I collected methodically. Patience became my shield during those weeks. Sleeping beside someone who'd betrayed me fundamentally was almost unbearable. Maintaining pleasant conversations was exhausting. Pretending nothing had changed required constant vigilance. But endurance had its own power. Every day I maintained the facade was another day of evidence accumulating. Another day of him growing more confident and therefore more careless. Another day closer to having everything I needed documented and legally protected before he realized I wasn't the compliant victim he'd believed I was. Dominic made his critical mistake during the third week after draining our accounts. He moved more money, this time from a retirement account we'd both contributed to. The withdrawal was larger than previous transfers. Nearly $15,000, removed in a single transaction. And he was sloppy about it. The description just read, personal withdrawal, without the careful vague language he'd used before. When I discovered it while checking accounts I technically still had access to, I felt a surge of cold satisfaction alongside the renewed betrayal. He was confident now. Arrogant. Comfortable in his belief that I'd stay quiet, that I'd accepted his authority over our finances, that I wouldn't question or challenge or document. Arrogant people always got lazy when they thought they'd won. When they believed their victim was defeated and compliant, they stopped being careful about covering tracks. They made bold moves that were easier to trace and harder to explain. I documented the retirement account withdrawal with timestamps and screenshots. Added it to my spreadsheet with a note about the unusual description. Sent copies to my attorney along with a message. He's getting bolder. Is this enough yet? Her response came within an hour. Almost. Let's give it one more week for the pattern to fully establish. Then we move forward. One more week of patience. A mask. Of sleeping beside someone who thought he'd successfully stolen my future. I could endure one more week. That week was the hardest. Every day felt stretched thin. Every interaction with Dominic required conscious effort to maintain normalcy. My attorney had explained the strategy. We needed the pattern fully documented, the evidence clear and comprehensive, before initiating any legal action. Moving too early might allow him to hide assets more effectively or create alternative explanations. But waiting meant continued exposure to his betrayal, continued pretense, continued sharing space with someone who'd proven he saw me as a resource to exploit rather than a partner to respect. I reminded myself repeatedly that short-term discomfort was necessary for long-term protection. That rushing forward emotionally would undermine the legal process. That patience now meant security later. My attorney filed preliminary paperwork during that week. Documents that would freeze assets and prevent further unauthorized withdrawals once served. But Dominic didn't know about any of it. He continued planning his separate future, spending stolen money, maintaining the affair I still hadn't confronted him about. He grew more relaxed, more openly dismissive, more confident in his control. That confidence, I knew, would make what came next even more devastating for him. The fall from assumed victory to actual consequence would be sharp and complete. And I'd built that fall myself, one documented transaction at a time. The formal process began on a Tuesday morning. Legal notices were sent. Accounts were flagged by court order. Asset freezes were implemented across our joint finances. Suddenly, Dominic couldn't move money as freely as he'd become accustomed to. He discovered the changes when trying to transfer funds that afternoon. His card was declined at a restaurant where he'd taken Sophie for lunch. I learned this later from reviewing the attempted transaction log. He came home that evening irritated, aggressive in a way he hadn't shown me before. "Something's wrong with the bank," he snapped, throwing his wallet on the counter. "They've frozen accounts," said something about legal holds. "It's obviously a mistake, some system error. I'll get it resolved tomorrow." I nodded sympathetically, keeping my expression concerned and confused. "That's strange. Do you want me to call them with you tomorrow?" "No," he said quickly, sharply. "I'll handle it. You don't need to be involved." Of course he didn't want me involved. Didn't want me speaking with bank representatives who could explain that the freeze wasn't an error, that court orders had been filed, that his unauthorized transfers had triggered legal protections. I made dinner while he paced the kitchen, making frustrated phone calls that went nowhere. Watching him lose the control he'd wielded so casually over our finances gave me a dark satisfaction I didn't bother feeling guilty about. A letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by certified mail requiring signature. Dominic signed for it while I was at work. When I came home that evening, I found him sitting at the kitchen table with the opened envelope in front of him, his expression darker than I'd ever seen it. He looked up when I entered, his eyes narrow with suspicion and barely contained anger. "Did you do something?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you know anything about this?" I set my purse down carefully, letting confusion show on my face. "Do what? What is that?" I gestured toward the letter without moving closer, maintaining physical distance. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This legal notice, about asset division and financial impropriety allegations, says you filed papers. That accounts are frozen pending review." His voice rose with each sentence, control slipping. "Did you do this?" I tilted my head slightly, meeting his eyes with carefully calibrated innocence. "I don't understand what you're asking me." "What papers?" The lie was deliberate, strategic. I needed to see how he'd react without the anchor of knowing I was fully aware and prepared. For the first time since our wedding 6 years ago, I saw uncertainty cross Dominic's face. Fear even. The confidence that had defined our entire marriage, that had allowed him to drain our accounts and command my silence, was cracking. He didn't know how much I knew. Didn't know how long I'd been preparing. Didn't know whether this was beginning or ending. Meetings followed over the next 2 weeks. Court-mandated financial disclosure sessions where Dominic was required to account for every transaction, every withdrawal, every transfer over the past year. Questions he couldn't answer convincingly. Transactions he couldn't explain away with vague descriptions. Documentation requested that exposed the pattern of his theft and deception. I attended some of those meetings, sitting quietly while attorneys asked pointed questions about $38,000 in joint account withdrawals, $15,000 from retirement funds, charges to hotels and jewelry stores and restaurants. Dominic tried charm first, treating the attorneys like they were being unreasonable, explaining that he'd made personal investments that would benefit our marriage eventually. When charm failed, he tried anger, raising his voice, accusing people of overreach, claiming privacy violations. When anger was shut down through procedural calm, he retreated into silence. Sullen, defeated silence that looked nothing like the confident control he'd wielded weeks before. I watched him unravel with the same enforced calm he'd demanded from me when emptying our accounts. No emotion, no outburst. Just steady observation as the man who'd stolen my financial security discovered that actions had consequences, that silence could be strategic rather than defeated, that the wife he'd dismissed as controllable had been documenting his crimes while he'd believed himself untouchable. Everything I'd documented over weeks of careful evidence gathering was now spoken aloud in formal settings. Dates of suspicious transactions read into official records. Dollar amounts tallied and compared against legitimate marital expenses. Destinations of transfers traced to accounts in Sophie Brennan's name, something forensic accountants had uncovered through subpoena. Not emotionally, not dramatically, precisely. With the clinical detachment I'd learned working in financial analysis, applied now to the destruction of my marriage. The room didn't need my pain to understand the damage Dominic had caused. The facts were enough. The pattern was clear. The theft was documented. My emotional devastation, while real and significant, wasn't required for legal proceedings. The truth existed independently of my feelings about it. That realization was both comforting and strange. I'd spent weeks managing my emotions, hiding my hurt, maintaining masks. But here, in these formal proceedings, my emotions were irrelevant to the outcome. The evidence stood alone, spoke for itself. required nothing from me except existence. Dominic's attorneys tried various defenses. That joint accounts meant joint discretion over spending. That married couples didn't need to report every transaction to each other. That what I called theft was actually reasonable financial decision-making. None of it held up against the documented pattern, the systematic deception, the deliberate concealment, the transfers to his mistress while commanding his wife to stay quiet. Dominic's access to all remaining joint accounts was formally restricted by court order. His explanations for withdrawals were dismissed as insufficient and contradictory. The confident control he displayed when draining our accounts drained out of him like air from a punctured tire over the course of these proceedings. I watched the transformation from across mediation tables and courtroom benches. The man who'd casually stolen $38,000 and told me not to be dramatic was reduced to someone frantically trying to justify his actions, to minimize the theft, to blame his wife for being unreasonable about standard marital finances. He looked at me during one session, his eyes meeting mine across the formal conference table, and I saw the moment he finally realized. I wasn't trapped. I hadn't been defeated. I'd been prepared. Every day of quiet compliance after he'd drained the accounts had been strategic patience. Every smile and pleasant conversation had been calculated mask-wearing. Every moment of apparent submission had been evidence-gathering. The wife he'd dismissed as controllable had documented his crimes with professional thoroughness. The woman he'd commanded to stay quiet had been building a legal case while he'd believed his command had worked. I held his gaze steadily, letting him see the truth. Then I looked away, back to the attorney presenting more evidence of his systematic theft. He didn't matter anymore. At home, the home we still technically shared during proceedings, Dominic tried different approaches. Begging came first. Late-night apologies delivered with tears I'd never seen from him before. I made a terrible mistake, he said, his voice breaking. I was confused, going through something I didn't know how to handle. It wasn't really about her. It was about me being scared of commitment, of our future, of growing up. I listened from my position on the far side of the bed, maintaining physical distance. Said nothing. Just let him talk. Then came blame. Stress had made him act out. Temptation had been too strong when Sophie had shown interest. I hadn't been paying enough attention to his emotional needs. Our marriage had problems I'd been ignoring. All of it deflection. All of it attempts to make his choices somehow shared responsibility, to spread guilt for his deliberate actions. I still said nothing. Let his explanations hit silence and fall away. Finally came the accusations. That I'd planned this all along. That I'd been looking for an excuse to leave. That my documentation proved I'd never trusted him, never really committed to our marriage. You were just waiting for me to make a mistake so you could destroy me, he said. I met his eyes then and replied quietly. No, Dominic. I was building a life with you until you decided to steal from that life to fund a different one. This is all your choice. I just paid attention. I packed my belongings over a weekend while Dominic was required to be elsewhere per temporary separation orders. Only what mattered, clothes, personal items, documents, my laptop. I left furniture, kitchen items, decorative objects we'd acquired together. None of it meant anything compared to my financial security and peace of mind. A friend helped me move, loading boxes into her truck without asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. The new apartment I'd rented was small, just one bedroom, but it was mine alone. My name on the lease. My money paying for it. My space that no one could violate or steal from. When Dominic returned to our marital home and found my belongings gone, he called immediately. I let it go to voicemail, listening later to his message. You planned this, he said. His voice tight with anger and something that sounded like genuine surprise. This whole time you were planning to leave. You let me think everything was fine while you prepared to destroy our marriage. I deleted the message without responding. But his words stayed with me, their irony almost too perfect. He'd destroyed our marriage when he'd drained our accounts and told me to stay quiet. when he'd chosen someone else and funded that choice with money I'd earned and saved. I just refused to disappear quietly the way he'd expected. I documented instead of collapsing, prepared instead of accepting, protected myself instead of letting betrayal define my future. The resolution came through formal channels over the following months. Clean and final in the way legal proceedings impose clarity on emotional chaos. Assets were accounted for. The $38,000 he'd taken from joint accounts was legally classified as marital asset misappropriation. The retirement fund withdrawal was unauthorized removal of jointly owned property. All of it documented, proved, and assigned consequences. I was awarded compensation for the stolen amounts plus additional damages for financial harm and emotional distress. Dominic was required to reimburse half of everything he'd taken, return my portion of retirement funds, and pay legal fees I'd incurred proving his theft. The divorce itself was granted on grounds of financial misconduct and adultery, both documented thoroughly through the evidence I'd gathered. He didn't lose because I'd screamed or made dramatic accusations. He didn't lose because I'd confronted him emotionally or tried to shame him publicly. He lost because the quiet, reasonable woman who kept the books had documented every transaction, every lie, every theft. Because evidence mattered more than emotion in legal proceedings. Because staying calm and methodical had been more powerful than any outburst. The woman he'd underestimated, dismissed as controllable, commanded to stay quiet. She'd been the one who'd built the case that cost him everything he tried to steal. I moved into a small apartment filled with natural light. 2 windows in the living room faced east, letting morning sun stream across hardwood floors I'd chosen myself. I opened new bank accounts at my preferred institution, listing only my name. Set up automatic bill payments and savings transfers that belonged entirely to me. Started rebuilding the financial security Dominic had tried to destroy. The first night in my own space, I slept without the knots in my stomach that had been constant during those weeks of maintaining masks. Without the tension of lying beside someone who'd betrayed me while pretending everything was normal. Without the fear that I'd lose everything because I'd trusted the wrong person. Peace felt unfamiliar after months of strategic silence and careful documentation. But it also felt earned. Not given or granted, but built through patience and preparation. Through refusing to let betrayal define my future. Through staying calm when calm was strategic and speaking up when speaking up was necessary. I'd protected myself when someone I'd trusted had tried to make me disposable. That protection had required uncomfortable silence, had demanded patience I'd barely possessed, had cost me short-term peace for long-term security. But I'd survived. More than survived, I'd rebuilt. The apartment was modest, my savings were recovering, and my future belonged to me again. That was worth every difficult moment. Dominic had once told me to stay quiet. Standing in our kitchen with my phone showing zeros where our account should have been. He'd commanded silence like he had the right to control my voice along with my money. I had stayed quiet. Not because his command had worked. Not because I'd been defeated or controllable or scared into submission. I'd stayed quiet long enough to protect myself. Long enough to document his crimes. Long enough to build a legal case that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Silence wasn't weakness when it was strategic. When it bought time for evidence gathering. When it allowed someone underestimated to prepare thoroughly before revealing exactly how much they'd observed and recorded. My silence had let Dominic believe he'd won, that his theft had succeeded, that his wife would accept betrayal without consequence. That belief had made him careless, had made him bold, had made him continue the pattern until the documentation was complete and undeniable. Now, months later in my own apartment with my own accounts and my own future, I understood something important about survival. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay quiet while preparing to speak louder than anyone expects. Document while others assume you're accepting. Build while they think you're broken. And walking away with your future intact, with your financial security restored, with your dignity and strength proven through careful preparation. That's not revenge. That's not even justice, though justice was served. That's freedom. And it's worth every difficult moment of strategic silence that bought the space to rebuild.